Hi, folks. How are you?
Great.
Great.
Awesome.
Good.
Well, welcome. We're just going to give people a couple minutes to plug in. We've got about 14-ish people registered, and we just, for those who are having trouble logging on or just racing to turn on their computers, we want to just give them a chance to get in. And
just waking up.
yeah, that's right. And we will we'll start in just a moment. Okay.
I'm bringing a guest, but he'll pay later.
Okay. Glad that you're here. Whenever I hear that rush of water on these classes, I always wonder, am I hearing somebody doing the dishes? Is somebody gardening? Are there other more interesting things going on?
Filling a tub.
Filling the tub, bathing
Yes.
as they learn.
I love that beautiful Earth view we have.
Yeah, Maryland's in outer space. I'm digging it.
Yeah, right on.
Glad you like it.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I should close my email. It's giving me distractions.
So, Rabbi, do you want to go over some housekeeping before we begin about questions?
Not really. Corey, do you have thoughts about when is a good time for people's questions clarifying? In other words, you want to take them along the way? You want to?
Yeah, I think we could take, if there's ones along the way that are about like immediate clarification of what I just said, then it's useful, then that's well. But if they're more general questions, we can just save them to the end, so we can
let's do that.
get through
Okay,
the stuff.
people can type into the chat.
But if
I'll
I'm
be
like talking
monitoring.
too fast or something like that, it'd be good to field that.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start in about another minute, and then we'll go.
All right. Mira Siegel, I think you were muted, but I think you might have been speaking to us.
She's trying to hi.
I was talking to myself, but
Oh, okay.
Chat is a good way for people to interact. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
we don't get to hear what you nice folks are having to say if there's
Right.
too many interruptions.
Only
That's
one of
true.
us is nice, but I hear you.
You have to guess which one it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Mira.
Okay.
Was it Myra?
Mira's my Yiddish name, so thank you for calling me
Okay,
that.
I'll stick to
Myra is
that,
my
yes.
name in English. My
Very
American
well.
name, but Mira's my Yiddish, so either one's fine.
Shalom, Mira. That's good.
Shalom.
Okay, let me just get a couple things ready, and then I will be ready to go.
Where are you, Rabbi?
I am broadcasting from an underground bunker in an undisclosed
Very
location.
good. Wow.
No, I am in my room. Hannah has this like great big room in our house that is her room in addition to her office, and I get to have this little nook in our bedroom. That is the nook. Although I have beautiful windows in front of me, I face north, and I'm looking out here to a partly cloudy sky, and over here to a gorgeous, huge tree, of which sort I don't know. Where are you?
I'm at the Wayfinding Academy in St. John's.
Oh, cool.
Where I do a lot of work. And I just had a class here this morning, and then the students left, and I'm still occupying this beautiful room. It's in it used to be a YWCA back in the day. And so
cool.
It still has the bones. So like this room has a fireplace in it. The other room is like a gymnasium that's used as a stage and a big classroom. It's a funky place.
I have a question. That's why I unmuted myself.
Okay.
Did you mute me because you heard my air conditioner?
No.
No, I didn't mute you.
Oh, well, it said you were muted by host.
Right.
Anyway,
I muted just because we're trying to keep people muted. But if you have a
right.
question,
I
while we're
had a
getting set up-
question. I have something on my schedule at 5 p.m. today. Do you have something else at 5 p.m. today, or did I put it at the wrong time?
Do we have anything?
Yeah.
Sorry, Torah? No, we don't have a program.
All right.
I'm free at 5 if you want to hang out.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, for a walk.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Pressman, should we start?
Indeed.
Okay. So welcome all to this class, which I think is rather important and that I think is going to be good for all of us. I know good for me, and I'm looking forward to learning and to sharing. But before we start, I just simply want to recognize, just to name what is going on in our country right now. I guess I want to name it simply because it's happening, not necessarily to connect it to our work here today, although I do think that it's connected because I think it's part of the background sense of anxiety and sometimes fear that some of us have about what's happening in the world all around, and we may have a chance to talk about some of those external sources of stress in our lives. But more to the point, I just want to name it because what is happening in our country is so profound. And I think that one thing that should be clear in the famous saying, in the famous teaching that, you know, not all are to blame, but all are responsible. And I think particularly for white folks, and in particular for, one might even say, for Jewish people all the more so, this is a time for us to really try to see and really try to listen and really put our hearts into the work of paying attention to what's happening in the world all around, and also the work of self-examination to see what are our what capacities do we have as individual citizens and as gigantic souls to contribute toward the healing of what's happening in our world, in our nation, and which is of course inextricable from our duties as Jews on this planet to heal the communities that we're in. There is and this is the last thing I'll say about this, and then we'll get right into the substance of our topic today. We often forget that the things that are happening out there in the broader world outside of the Jewish community, though they often don't seem like they're immediately on our radar and our scope of concern, are actually precisely our scope of concern. Because if we look at the origins of where the Jewish people come from, they come from, of course, Abraham, the original Hebrew, the original Ivri. And God takes Abraham in Parshat Lech Lecha, when he first identifies him in the book of Genesis, to be his partner in covenant. And God says to him, you know, one day, if you follow this covenant, all of the people of the earth will bless themselves through you, and you will be a blessing. Meaning that your descendants, Abraham, if you learn how to create holiness into the world, that holiness is going to radiate far beyond you and your descendants. It's going to radiate to all of the people of the world. And so if we take our charge seriously as Jews, and take our own text seriously as Jews, and our own history seriously as Jews, we must find a way to partake of the beautiful blessing of being sources of healing and goodness in the world. So I just wanted to start with that observation. And let me now tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. So first of all, I'm so thrilled and truly honored. I know that's a phrase that kind of begins every time two people do any work together. One person has to say they're honored to work with the other guy. But in this case, I truly am, because this is a fantastic fellow, rich in knowledge and wisdom. And I'm excited not only to teach with him, but really to learn from him. And I want to say that what our task is to share with you wisdom and knowledge, but really principally tools that you can integrate into your lives to confront the sources of internal or external, I should say, anxiety that make it very, very difficult to get through or impossible perhaps to get through difficult times? And what are the ways that we have at our disposal, both in the Jewish tradition and based on broader practices and scientific research into the body, into the brain, to really open ourselves up to grapple with the challenges that face us, and to enliven our lives with resilience and hope and joy to get through these tough times and any stressful and difficult times ahead. So I'm going to share some thoughts about the Jewish tradition, and then Corey will introduce some thoughts about his work. He will then give you some practices. He'll get quite specific, and then I will close by sharing some practices from the Jewish tradition. But before I jump in, let me just turn to my friend and co-teacher Corey and ask him just to briefly introduce himself, and then I will dive into some Jewish reflections on the nature of hope.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And clearly everyone here knows that the honor is mine, but I appreciate you taking the stab at honoring me. I appreciate it. And so I am Corey. Hello. And I work as a teacher and an artist and a writer and as a counselor, essentially. And all the work that I do in teaching and counseling is around helping people identify their own idiosyncratic sources of vitality, of energy or of spirit. It's chi. It's said so many different ways in different traditions, but to get really intentional about figuring out what those are for yourself. And then that's almost the easy part, for as hard as that can be, but then structuring those into your lives in a way that makes them sustainable and doable and beyond the I know I should, but I don't. And that kind of guilting of oneself that comes so much with insight. It's almost an unfair shadow of insight. You learn about yourself, and then you have new ways of being disappointed in yourself. So I'm trying to get you past that by manualizing and concretizing this wisdom. And I do this work with individuals in a one-on-one scenario. I do this work as a teacher at places like the Wayfinding Academy, where I sit now, which is an alternative college. And I do this work in the School of Nursing at University of Portland, where I'm working with the nurses to devise healthcare practices or self-care practices for healthcare providers, so that burnout isn't an expected part of their profession.
Great.
That's where I'm coming from.
All right. Thank you so much. And we're gonna dive right in. So I actually, as I said, I want to begin a little bit in the mind, and by turning to some of the texts of the Jewish tradition to talk about the challenge of hope in difficult times. Now, some of this I'm going to use one of the texts that I actually use in my Shavuot teaching, and I know a couple of you were on there, but we'll have a chance to explore one of these teachings again. And I'll do that in just a moment. And I've got some text that I'll share my screen with you so we can read over those. But I want to just lay the groundwork for what is at stake in this work, so that we understand that when we're talking about the challenge of hope and anxiety, that from where I sit, those are not, as they're often understood, simply psychological challenges or simply kind of technical challenges like, how do I hack my body so I can deal with these problems I face? And they're not even problems of productivity, as they often are in our culture discussed. Well, such and such a person is depressed or anxious, and so they've lost 3 days of work. How terrible that is. Indeed, those are terrible. But from where I sit, from where we sit, issues of despair and hope and anxiety are at their root theological. They're spiritual challenges, because when you look underneath them, they have to do with the ways that we look at it into the world and make sense of it, and seek to see a path forward, which ultimately means that we're looking at the purpose of our lives and how we function in it. And moments of hope and moments of lack of hope and moments of despair and overwhelming anxiety are moments in which we are really saying theologically, I don't believe that the world can change from this moment on, or I don't believe that I am equipped to do what I have to do in this world. Now, even if you don't consider your theology to be a simple theology of, well, I believe in God, or even if you're not a believer at all, I would argue that the issue of having hope, which is of course an issue for every person, we all need hope to move through the world, that is, I would argue, inherently a religious question. You might want to put other labels on it, but it's a religious or maybe a spiritual question at its heart, because in my language, it has to do with how we navigate the world we're in and how we view the possibilities of our lives. So with that, before I share a text, we're going to start incredibly deep by talking about a little bit of Kabbalah. So some of you in the Kabbalah class that I'm teaching on every other Monday, that is about the Share Ora, the Joseph Chikatilia book. I'm going to talk about some Kabbalah that's a little bit different from that. So even those who are in this class, I hope will learn something here, and some of it you may have heard. So I want to talk about the Kabbalah of the Ari, of the Holy Ari, Isaac Luria, which is a few centuries later than Chikatilia. And as I share this idea, for some of you, it's going to be familiar because you've probably heard aspects of it. The issue that the Ari talks about is he says that initially the whole world was just filled with total unity, total divine oneness. That's all there was. There was not even any creation. There was nothing except God's oneness in a way that we can't even imagine it. There's no metaphor, there's no paradigm, there's no way for us to ever imagine what the world was like before creation. But what we can say about it is that somehow it was filled with God's infinite light. In Hebrew, we call it Ein Sof, which literally means without end or infinite. It was just God's perfect unity fulfilling everything. And because God's unity fulfilled everything, there was no space for you or for me or for anything, any created being. For reasons that are beyond even the Kabbalists' capacity, they name quite clearly, we can never know this, but for some reason, the one, the Ein Sof, the infinite, desired to create the world. And in so doing, the Ein Sof had to go through a process of what's called tzimtzum, and I don't want to get, we don't have to worry too much about Kabbalistic vocabulary here because I'm driving towards a practical point in a moment, believe it or not. The Holy One, the Ein Sof, engaged in what's called tzimtzum, which means self-contraction, right? So if God's oneness filled everything, God had to make a space, so to speak, where God's infinite power was drawn back. So there was a space for created beings to exist. So that process of self-contraction created what is called, what the Kabbalists called the Chalel Pinui, which means essentially like an empty void. And it was within that empty void that the world was created. Okay, in order for you to exist, for me to exist, for there to be up, down, sky, earth, time, space, there had to be an empty void within which it was created. And in doing that, there was automatically created the possibility for something other than God's perfect, harmonizing, magnificent, supernal, heavenly light. So in order for us to be, in order for us to exist, there had to be the absence of God. So if we want to take the crazy task of taking Kabbalistic texts and trying to talk about them without overly burdened religious language, we would say simply that in order to exist, we have to face the possibility that things will go wrong. And that it's in the nature of human life, as the Jewish tradition says, and every religious tradition, every spiritual tradition ends up saying, that built into existence is suffering, which is, in Kabbalistic terms, what it means is that as we live and look out into the world, what we're feeling and seeing are consequences of the Chalal HaPinui, of the empty void. Right? And so there can be suffering, there can be pain, there can be injustice, there can be cruelty, because there's been a space created for us to live. But what I want to say, which gets to our topic of hope, is that in the Kabbalists' telling of the kind of physical DNA of the universe, or the spiritual, I should say, DNA of the universe, the creation of that empty void, and therefore the possibility of nothingness and suffering and evil and pain and anxiety, is not the end of the story, because God built the world in such a way that those living within the halal pinui, those living within the void, would be able to ultimately draw out the light of unity out of that void. So ultimately, the goal of the Creator, according to the Kabbalah, is to have gone from perfect unity to creating a space for the created beings, and then the created beings to create unity and goodness out of that empty space. And that therefore, within the Halal Pinui, says the Kabbalist, that there is this sliver, always the sliver of divine light that is so hard for us to see. It's so heavily obscured by all of the things that we see around us, by we could say racism, we could say injustice, but it could just be more localized things in our lives: economic anxiety, fear, worry that we won't be able to achieve our dreams or ambitions. It's the divine light is so heavily covered over by those things that it is so hard to see. But it's simply a fundamental principle of our tradition that there is always the possibility, and that even in the most desperate moments, therefore, we have to know that there are steps that we can take to connect to that divine light, which is to say that there's never a moment when hope is lost. And no matter how anxious we feel or fearful we feel about what's going on around us, or no matter how occluded our vision of the future looks, it is always the case that there is possibility and hope. We can always tap into it instantly if we have the tools to open ourselves to seeing it and hearing it. In other words, the problem is not ever the absence of hope and the absence of possibility. That never is the case, because it is always there. It's built into the universe. The challenge, therefore, it has to do with our developing our capacity to see and to hear those opportunities for hope. Okay, so that is the first thing that I wanted to say, and the second one will be much more brief, which ties into this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Corey to pick it up from there. So now let me share my screen with you. Sometimes, by the way, I'll confess that as a teacher, sometimes I create materials just so I can hit the share screen button in Zoom, because I find the technology so fun. Okay, hold on.
It is very satisfying.
It is so satisfying. Okay, can you all see that?
Good share
okay.
screen.
Okay, so again, for those who are in the Shavuot class, you're familiar with this teaching, and I'll do it sort of quickly. So in Exodus 6:5, God speaks to Moses. So Daniel, will you read that in the English, what God says to Moses here? You're muted, my friend.
Oh, that was his mouse.
There you go.
We were trying to move with your cursor with our mouse. And it just,
Oh, right. I've been there.
I've now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. I have remembered my covenants.
Okay. So God says that he hears he's heard the crying out of the Egyptians, and what looks like the verse that I dropped off here is the verse in which he says, I'm aware of the burdens of the sivlot of the Israelites. And so usually that's just understood to mean they're in slavery, and that's what he means by burdens. But Simcha Bunim, who was I think the second or third generation after the Baal Shem Tov, explains why the Torah uses the specific word of sivlot, or burden or burdens. So does somebody else want to read this? Ann, Prahl, will you read this in the English from Simcha B'nam?
Why does the Torah not use the word servitude or some other word, but rather sivlot, burden? Because initially enslavement was very difficult for them, but eventually they got used to it, and it even became natural. When the Holy Ones saw that they had become so accustomed to their slavery to Pharaoh and were ensnared in the material and brickwork that they no longer even felt it, God said, I will take them out from under the burdens of Egypt. If you are at the point that you can endure the burden of Egypt, it is not good, and I must free you.
So there's a lot more that could be said about this, but I want to use this text as a kind of reflection on the Kabbalistic teaching that I just offered, and as a segue into where Corey's teaching, to say that there's an incredibly deep and important and practical teaching for us here. So again, what he's trying to do is explain why the Torah uses the word burden as opposed to slavery. Why is it that God has perceived their burden and not their servitude? Because Simcha B'nam understands the word burden to imply something that can be endured. And as long as the Israelites were able to endure it, then there was no hope of redemption, because they would just sort of expanded their capacity to handle stress and trauma and suffering in a way that was ultimately self-damaging. Because they didn't get to the breaking point, they just kind of went on with the suffering. So only when they cried out to God, and only essentially when they said, I cannot take it anymore, could the redemption begin. And so I'm saying this, I want to draw 2 points out of this very briefly in wrapping up. One is that we have to pay attention to we have to keep a wary eye, I would say, on our capacity to tolerate things that are not good for us and not good for the world around us. Because human beings have an incredible capacity to put up with all kinds of things, and to so many strategies that we've developed over years for just dealing with stuff when they're not in a good place. So the fact that we're surviving day to day does not mean that things in our lives are as they should be. And so we have to be attuned to ourselves and to our stress levels to really evaluate if we're on the path that we ought to be on, and if we're actually moving towards expanding our lives. And then the second thing, drawing on the Kabbalistic teaching I offered, is simply the idea that you can see in this text the very idea that in suffering there is hope. Because it was when they got to the point where they couldn't take anymore that the redemption would begin. Because now they would see that there had to be a different course. They could no longer fit within the Egyptian model. And in their very pain and in their very suffering was precisely the capacity for moving things in a new direction and the redemption. So in conclusion, I just want to say that that hope is never gone. As Rabbi Nachman says, there's no such thing as despair, because hope is built into the world. So we just have to develop our capacity to tap into it. And therefore we have to be very attuned to our own coping mechanisms, making sure that those coping mechanisms are not indeed the obstacles to our developing our lives in a new direction. So I'm going to hand it over to Corey to share his perspective on the question of hope and resilience and joy from a very different direction.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. I appreciate that. Snaps for you, Rabbi. That was so inspiring, especially the part about how hope is ubiquitous. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Can you see my screen, my little whiteboard? That hope is ubiquitous, and
Yeah.
our job is to, thank you, our job is to find that hope. And maybe even one of the purposes of suffering is to set you up in order to find hope. And in seeking out hope, you find divinity, and there you are. But so that's an amazing thing. It's like this beautiful arrangement, this game we play. But that then requires the skill of paying attention. And it's the paying attention part to the universe that makes you maybe a skilled human being. If you can pay attention and find those thin rays of hope, then then the game is afoot. But what gets in the way of paying attention is that those feelings of stress and anxiety, just call them out for what they are, Rabbi. That is feelings of stress and anxiety that prevents you from even in the depression and anxiety that comes with that. That even prevents you from thinking you can pay attention. And even if you kind of pass that, you're just even a little stressed out, it's hard to pay attention. So interestingly, to use a piece from what you had just said, Rabbi, the idea that the sivlot, the burden, the thing that you've taken on and say, I can endure this. I think the sivlot that I want to address right now is the sivlot of being stressed, of stress and anxiety.
Right.
I think that's something that we take on and be like, well, it's almost expected of us, at least in our civilization, to be stressed out. How often do we use I'm so busy as a badge of honor, or just being stressed? And that state of mind, that state of being, is lauded in some ways, and so it's a burden we're supposed to be able to handle. I love the idea of just shedding that burden and being like, I give up, no more. Well, I want to be stressed. And once you get past that, then you're able to pay attention, see the thin rays of divinity, and be full, be wholer, or at least be on the path. And all of that is prevented by stress itself. So even though we're going to talk about sources of vitality in your life and wed those to Jewish existence, nothing really happens until we talk about stress at a very physiological level, because it is a physiological thing. It's built into our beings. We were created this way. I think in part as potentially, I don't want to muse too theologically myself as I'm not fully qualified, but seeing as we were created with this mechanism for stress, I think that's part of the test, is how long you'll hold stress as the sivlot. And so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the anatomy of stress and how this works. Can we do that? Yes, thumbs up on talking about the anatomy of stress. It's important, and it's important not just in spiritual life, but the work I do with the nurses, for example. We just talk about the therapeutic alliance between a doctor or a nurse and the patient, and you have to be able to reduce the stress of the patient for most healing to actually happen. And it happens a lot in psychology. You have to get rid of stress first before anything can really occur of note. So, but this is a boogaboo that gets in the way. So what is it? And this is a relatively newly studied and known thing, the sort of neuroanatomy of stress. But I want to turn you onto it in layperson's terms, because the implications are huge. And the practices given the anatomy of stress, the practices for its avoidance are relatively simple. Not easy, but simple. I think there's a difference there, unfortunately. But this is kind of how stress works. Watch this. This is, ooh, do you like that green? I surprised myself. I didn't know I chose green.
Are you, by the way, Corey, if you're just trying to outdo me on the shared screen thing here, we'll have to talk about that later.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm trying. I think
we're all very impressed.
Yeah, I'll teach you how to do this, though. You're going to love it. Yeah, but okay, anyway, so here is you, and here is a phenomena in reality. Here's something happening. And when that something happens, you can either be cool with what's happening and just accept it. There is something happening in the world. Or you can perceive what's happening as a threat. And when you perceive it as a threat, you physiologically enter another state that we're just going to call stress. See that face, the stress face? Make the stress face, that's good. And the stress face, remember, isn't from an actual threat. I'm using these words on purpose. What kind of threat did I say that it was? A perceived threat. And when you perceive threat, you go into a stress state, which is its own very unique neurological state. And it is totally normal. If anything comes out of what I'm telling you today, I want to normalize stress. Stress is a very normal response to perceived threat. When a mammal or a lizard or a bird, insects too, when they perceive threat, there are certain behaviors that get enacted, and they're very normal. They're part of being a self-healing, sentient being. Our problem isn't that we have the stress response, it's for how long we have it and how much power we give it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So when you experience something that you're perceiving as a threat, the specific thing that happens is that you enter into a state that's called sympathetic nervous system dominance. And I'm going to keep this in layperson's terms. But essentially, you have an autonomic nervous system that does all the automatic stuff in your body. Hence, it's called autonomic. One half of it is called the sympathetic nervous system. And that's the part that gets you ready for fight or flight or freeze when something bad happens, when you perceive threat. I'm doing it now. This is the international performance dance for SNS dominance. Yeah, thank you very much. And you're tense. So what happens when you're SNS dominant? We're going to go through a whole list of things. You get the idea. And that's getting you ready for those things. Remember, what would I said what they were. They were fight. So you're going to attack your way out of this problem. Or flight, which is what? Another way of saying that, right? Out of Dodge. I'm out of here.
Well, everybody's muted, so it's hard for people to respond.
I know. But it's just one of you responds. I'll feel less alone in the world. Or freeze is another one too. And some animals they go into the freeze response. You've seen this maybe when you get near a cricket and it disappears. You can't hear it anymore. Frogs freeze a lot. Turtles have an amazing freeze. They go into the shell and they just freeze and they're just hanging out there. And people can do that too. People do all of these things. Your SNS dominant, your sympathetic nervous system is made to allow you to do these things. And actually fainting is an example of freeze. Do you want to hear the fancy biological word for the freeze response? It's cool. You're going to dig this, Rabbi, because it's got the Greek root thanatosis.
That sounds like one of the bad guys from one of the movies my kids watch.
Right, exactly. Lord Thanatosis. But you get thanatonic, which is you enter this freeze response. And all of this, again, is relatively healthy stuff to have happen if there's an actual threat or if you're perceiving a threat. And by the way, that perception of threat is really interesting. It turns out that we will perceive things as threats if they pass a certain strain threshold. I want you to notice a metaphor that's afoot. All of science is based on metaphors of some kind or another. Well, I guess all of language is really. The scientists who discovered all of this used metaphors from the construction world. So you hear strain, they were actually talking about strain on I-beams, how you put a lot of strain on a big beam, it strains a little bit. And so you experience emotional strain when you're perceiving a threat. And then it becomes stressed when it gets too much power on it. And so you cross it, in material science, they talk about the strain threshold of a material. And if you pass the strain threshold, it's now in a stressed state, which gives it capacity to be fatigued. And if it's fatigued, it's destroyed. And so that's kind of the strain to stress to fatigue is the same thing that emotions experience. It's just that they're using that metaphor. And all of us have various strain thresholds when you perceive a threat. And what's interesting, at least I think it is, Rabbi, tell me if this is interesting. Different people have different strain thresholds. And interestingly, inside an individual, you'll have a different strain threshold depending on all kinds of number of factors. So let's say I just got an envelope that has the letters IRS on it. Pretty much anything that happens inside a 2 or 3 hour bubble of that is going to be perceived as a threat because my strain threshold is so low. Stub your toe, it's the same thing. But you're on vacation, you're hanging out, you're having a good time, ocean waves. Not much can stress you out. Not much is perceived as a threat. It's all cool. Yeah? You familiar with that state of mind? And when it's all cool and you're staring at the ocean is when you suddenly see the tiny slivers of divinity in the world. But they're really not possible. I'm never going to see God when I get a letter from the IRS. It's going to take some time to work through that. So ultimately, part of what we're going to work with, and today even, is how to manage this strain threshold and keep it as wide open as possible. So there's kind of two things being implied by the neurology of stress already. One is that it has something to do with the perception of threat. And two has to do with that strain threshold. And then third is going to have to deal with the actual neurology of SNS domination and how to get out of it. But I want to return for a second to this perceived threat and strain threshold business. This is one of the interesting things about being a human. And Rabbi, I'd love your opinion on this, as humans versus other animals. Interestingly, like I said, it's normal to have this sympathetic nervous system dominant state. It protects you. But what's wild is when a lizard or even a monkey or a dog or a cat, whatever, experiences SNS dominance, fight, flight, or freeze, as soon as that threat alleviates, they go back to normal state. They go back to normal functioning, or what's called parasympathetic nervous system dominance, where their heart rate can slow down, you can be calm and be kind of in the moment for real. But humans, this is something about how we were made. Humans' biggest gift, if you will, is probably the fact that we have an imagination. And we can be the kind of sub-creators that we are. Our imaginations are amazing. But the imagination's shadow is that we can perceive threats when they're not really there. So imagine a turtle who goes into a shell when you walk by, but then in this shell, he's like, he could come back. There could be more. There could be, I could come out and there'd be a crow. I'm just gonna stay in this shell for the rest of my life. And how many people do we know that are that? But interestingly, that's the problem with humans, if you will, is not that we have fight or flight or SNS dominance, it's that we imagine ourselves into being chronically SNS dominant.
Interesting. Right. Yeah, I do think, I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this at another time, but yeah, I do think there's definitely a kind of spiritual connection there, because we have, I think in a way you could say Jewishly our natural state is to be very deeply connected and very hopeful and perceiving the divine possibilities in every moment. But though that might be at the core level of our creation, our sort of default stance is actually not to tap into that, because we're so locked into ego. It takes a lot of work to get out of that, which is why there's so many different religious traditions.
Right. So that's just part of the struggle, just how it's arranged.
Yeah.
That chronic SNS dominance is an option and potentially a default. So that's one of the barriers to entry to union. So let's talk about SNS dominance for a sec and look at what it involves. Are there any questions at this point before I kind of take a deep dive into 3? I've kind of jammed with you on 1 a little bit and jammed with you on 2, and now I'm going to 3. Are we cool?
Raise your hand if you've got a question, either electronically or physically.
Peeps.
Okay. Oh,
Shake like this.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So the way SNS dominance works is wild. It's actually mediated. It's wild in its simplicity. It's mediated by one nerve in particular in your body called, I wrote that very poorly, I'm sorry, called the vagal nerve. And this nerve is, I think, the largest nerve in the body. I'm not going to say that with total authority. It is a very large nerve. And it starts sort of around the level of your mouth and goes down your body. One half goes down the front of your body and attaches to your heart, lungs, gut, diaphragm situation. And the other half goes all the way down the back of your body and attaches to your pelvic floor. It's an enormous nerve. And its main job is to enact SNS dominance. So when you're freaking out about something, or let's get more medical, when you're perceiving a threat, as soon as you perceive the threat, the vagal nerve does its thing. And its thing is to get your body ready for fight, flight, or freeze. So you can tell me, what do you think some of those symptoms are of fight, flight, or freeze? I'm going to write one right away, but feel free to chime in. Has anyone ever been stressed out or experienced stress?
Yeah, folks, jump in here. Give us a sense. Who's got the courage to share?
Fast breathing.
Oh, yeah. Respiration goes up, which is great because that gives your muscles lots of oxygen in order to be tense, to get ready for fighting or flighting or freezing. Freezing is really the ultimate muscle tension. So you get all this respiration that goes up. It's getting ready for that tiger that's in front of you, or that IRS envelope, or whatever. Both of them are the same. That's what's so interesting about this. You go from your cerebral cortex where you're thinking, and you can thin slice the difference between an IRS envelope and a tiger. But as soon as you go into SNS dominance, all your vagal nerve knows is tiger. Let's just get ready for the worst. This is a tiger. So you go into muscle tension, high respiration, high heart rate. That sound familiar? Heart beats faster to get the blood to those muscles. Interestingly, with muscle tension, you experience sore muscles in only 2 scenarios in life. One scenario is when you're actually using your muscles a lot in this thing people do call exercise. And so if you're using your muscles a lot doing this exercise thing, they'll be sore. The other source of sore muscles is muscle tension from SNS dominance. And I personally, when I'm, because I often experience stress, will go to bed with sore shoulders as if I've been like lifting stuff all day. And all I've done is freaked out all day. But I still have earned myself muscle tension pain. You familiar with that? Yes, even the rabbi. Another interesting thing that occurs is you actually gain tunnel vision, literally. It's hard to see with your peripheral vision when you're in SNS dominance. You see what's in front of you very clearly. Isn't that fascinating? because again, you're trying to either fight or run away from this tiger. So your vision gets tunneled. And another thing is that you actually lose your cortical function, thinking with your actual brain. You start thinking more with the lizard brain. And so when you lose that kind of access, the electricity in your cortex goes down. There's a switch in your brain that sends electricity and blood. So the cortex versus the lizard brain, the cortex kind of turns off. And when that turns off, you then lose control of the language centers of your brain. And so you start experiencing intrusive thoughts, usually thoughts about fight, flight, or freeze. So when you're freaked out, all you can think about is the perceived problem. If I open that letter from the IRS, it's over for me. I know what's going to happen next. They're going to come, they're going to take the car. I'm going to be eating dirt in the gutter. I'm going to try to live with the rabbi. He's going to kick me out. It's going to be terrible. And all I can do is think about that. You lose all rationality. And you actually have these thoughts that appear out of nowhere, these dysphoric daydreaming that you're capable of. It's this skill. It's another shadow of the imagination that's completely flipped on by this. I could go on, there's more, but I think you're getting the idea. I'm going to add, there's two more because they're favorites of mine. You become very impulsive, very jumpy, because you're not thinking. You don't have your cerebral cortex available to you. And you also become very busy, move around a lot, very antsy, all that extra energy.
Well, so why do you have extra energy? It's sort of, you would think the opposite, because sometimes people kind of like become sort of depressed and can't move. What's that extra energy about?
I'm glad you asked. It's in the moment that you get that extra energy to do the fight, flight, or freeze that you're going to do.
Right.
And again, it's supposed to be just a moment, but I'm glad you mentioned depression, because what happens, and this gets back to the crux of the matter, is that experiencing all of this again is like super normal. I want to normalize it. It's fine. You're supposed to experience this. It's how we're made. That's how you get away from that tiger. That's how our species did its thing. Our problem, though, is that it becomes chronic. So you're chronically sympathetic nervous system dominant, to the point where it's hard to switch out of it. And you spend hours and hours a day in this state, to the point where this becomes, as you were just pointing out, Rabbi, this becomes the normal state.
Right.
This is kind of you're supposed to be. Yeah, I'm busy, I'm antsy, and this starts to rob your body of its like neurological capacity for joy. And this easily leads to depression. And you're never paying attention while this is happening. This is depression and anxiety from this being chronic.
Right.
And so you see then that the issue at hand is sympathetic nervous system dominance, not its existence. We don't want to, like, I would never take a pill to get rid of this possibility of experiencing this, but rather that it gets chronic with us. And when you're in this state, it's easy to perceive just about everything else as a threat. So it becomes this spiral of feeling threatened by everything. Am I making sense? Is this something that you know, people that you love that experience?
I experience it myself.
Great, and I wanted to normalize that even for you. I'm happy for you in that this isn't a disorder. This is the human condition, I'm afraid, or at least it is in civilization. Not a disorder. It's not anything but just a fact that we are often SNS dominant, and we're chronically so. So the name of the game then is to get past this. So how do you get past SNS dominance? And basically you do it, can I explain how really quickly using some sort of non-religious practices, but I'm really eager to hear how you can bring some Jewish life into this. But essentially, you can get past it really just by working with that vagal nerve. Imagine there was a way to tell your nervous system not to freak out. It would give your brain back to yourself. And you can do that. Can I erase this board? Is that okay? Okay, I'm gonna blow on it. So.
Wow, this guy has game. I don't know what I'm up against here.
Someone speaking, I don't hear anything. So you can get past this by just doing a really quick two-step dance I call check and choose. Scientists call it something else. They call it interoception and self-regulation. Interoception is a beautiful word, looking inside yourself. But you can basically get into the habit of checking your sympathetic nervous system to see if it's in that state. Is my mouth dry because I'm not digesting things? Is my pelvic floor clenched? Is my tush clenched? Is my heart rate up? Am I breathing a little too fast? Almost, I'd say 90% of the time I just do a check, I am in that state. Oh, I got all my muscles are tight. I'm like, I didn't realize, even now, because I feel threatened because I'm publicly speaking and the rabbi is watching me. This is terrifying, as you can imagine. My breath is getting shallow. If I just stop and take a deep breath, I already feel better. So just check, get into the habit of interocepting yourself and knowing that you're almost always perceiving a threat. I just realized how tight my neck and shoulders are. Just from interoception, you loosen up enough just to kind of get there already. But interestingly, so after checking and looking inside yourself and seeing, I don't know what I was about to draw. Okay, forget that. Seeing what's going on inside yourself, you can then do something really interesting. You can sort of hack your vagal nerve. What's cool about the vagal nerve is that it works top down. Your brain tells your body, freak out. But then interestingly, the vagal nerve works bottom up. And if you can relax the muscles attached to your vagal nerve, it will tell your brain everything's okay. So you can do this just by relaxing the muscles attached to the vagal nerve. So let's do that now. Can we try that now?
Please.
Rabbi?
Yeah, please do it. Lead us in.
I'm just going to turn you on to two very non-religious exercises, but I think there are religious corollaries to this. That's the right word. I want to do something called the wet noodle. Watch this. So this is good to do sitting, but even the things I'm teaching you now can always be done on the fly. You can do a version of the wet noodle pretty much any time, but we're going to do a deep wet noodle. Just hang it out. Sit in your chair, deep breath, long exhale. If you just start with your head and relax your neck and let your head droop down, keep breathing and let your faces, the muscles of your face loosen. So even your mouth and cheeks go down a little bit. You feel your shoulders loop when you do that. Get your shoulders loose and let gravity pull them. Gravity wants to pull them, you're fighting it. Now twinkle your fingers a little bit and let your hands relax. Now twinkle your toes. Get your feet nice and relaxed. Let your knees go out to the sides like they want to. Take a breath into this. Feel gravity hugging your body. And now tighten the muscles you would tighten if you were stopping yourself from peeing. And hold those there for 3, 2, 1. Now loosen those muscles. Take a breath and come back to me. You are now parasympathetic nervous system dominant. You are fully a human being in this moment. This will last only a couple of seconds. But here you are. We just hacked your vagus nerve. Hopefully you feel different, but you should. And if you haven't, we should just try it again. But the wet noodle is an amazing thing. And then you can kind of do what I call a super sigh. Hands behind your back, tilt your chest out, deep breath, exhale. But make sure your exhale is longer than your inhale. That's where the magic happens. I actually hear things in the room differently now. Colors look different. More cortical. I'm in control of my thoughts. Again, this doesn't last forever, but you're now parasympathetic nervous system dominant. You've done what I've called a wet noodle with a pelvic floor exercise and a super sigh. And that's all it takes to come back to this. And if you get in the habit of interocepting, I'm starting to lose it. I feel it now. So I'm talking publicly and it's scary and the rabbi's watching. It's God. But now I can just do it and I can wet noodle while I'm talking to someone and they don't have to know that's what's going on. And sometimes you even space out for a second. But if you can do the wet noodle and the super sigh on the fly with the pelvic floor loosening exercise, these things will get you parasympathetic nervous system dominant, which means your heart rate slows down, the blood and electricity goes back to your cortex, you can think again. Sometimes it doesn't last long, but being there is the only way you're going to see the filaments of the divine in the universe. So even if you're here for a minute or two, that's time to do the good work. You're going to flip back, and that's fine. What are you going to do when you flip back? Just check and choose again. I check and choose over 100 times a day. But it becomes a habit. Yes, Rabbi.
First of all, I love the wet noodle in particular. When you said, I forget what you said about gravity, really feeling gravity.
Let it hug you, yeah.
Yeah. That was a beautiful image, and I could really feel it. So I remember that when one of the classes that I had to take in rabbinical school that I just really resented was called homiletics, which is a word that sounds like it's from the 19th century because the class was probably invented in the 19th century, and it's essentially about how to give sermons and and I had no use for it, except I do remember one thing they taught us that was very useful, and maybe you can talk about the physiology of this. they said that when you're about to go up for like your first sermon on the first high holidays that you ever do as a rabbi, and you're feeling like all stressed and tight and just miserable, what they said was breathe out. I remember this, breathe out slowly over your top lip, like, or over your bottom lip, like in a way that you're sort of restraining your breath, but you are breathing out. And they said that it would, the teacher said it would de-stress you, and it works like magic. It's unbelievable. Do you know about that practice and what's going on when that happens?
Yeah, essentially what's happening is you are regulating your vagal nerve, and you're regaining parasympathetic nervous system dominance. You can think about your speech and not perceive the audience as a threat, because it's not at all an actual physical threat. There's zero tigers out there. You're not going to get hurt. So it gets you back into thinking. And there's something about, I don't quite understand the mechanics of it, but there's something about that long, slow exhale. It's during the exhale that the articulate singulus, that part of your brain that switches things back and forth, it's only when you're exhaling that it can do its job of switching. And that's actually one of the reasons people conjecture why the sigh evolved to begin with. That when you're stressed out, when you're sighing, gives your articulator a chance to try to, let's jump these things back to the brain so you can think about it. So doing a little trick of getting it running over your lip and all of that is just getting you to slow, intentional exhale. Yeah,
boy, that's so interesting. So I didn't realize that was a vagal nerve exercise.
Yeah, you were hacking your vagal nerve and getting out of sympathetic nervous system dominance, back into a state of parasympathetic nervous system dominance, which only lasted as long until you got to the podium. But that's precious time. And then when you get back there, and while you're giving the talk, you're exhaling more than you're inhaling, and that might calm you down right there.
Right. That's interesting.
You can loosen up and not grab, but that's why, and this is what I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. The scientists who study this pointed out that different cultures everywhere seem to have what they call vagal rituals.
Right.
But there are rituals or practices that mimic these things, like singing and chanting. There's always exhaling along your inhaling, and that calms people down. Davening and kind of intentional movement of your body keeps you, it's impossible to be sympathetic nervous system dominant while singing.
Right.
So they're positing that just like all cultures have clothing and buildings, but the clothing and buildings differ, all cultures might have vagal rituals, and those differ too.
Right.
So what aspects of Jewish worship and being might we be able to leverage?
Right. Great. So first of all, I'm
going to stop sharing.
Okay. You're going to blow it away? Okay. So Anne Prahl said she had to duck out. She was totally loving it, and she was going to watch on the recording. But what I want to say is that first of all, so this process of preparing for this class is also, I've learned a lot also, and it's encouraged me to explore some aspects of Jewish teaching in a new way for me. So Corey actually sent me this fascinating article about sort of the research into vagal nerve science and reflections on contemplative traditions and how they use it. And if you're interested in that, it's pretty nerdy, it's pretty research heavy, but it's definitely interesting and reflective from a religious perspective. If you're interested in that, drop Corey a line that he can send you the original PDF file. What I want to say is there are practices that everybody here knows out of the Jewish tradition that address this, because for sure it's not that traditional Judaism has like an elaborate theory about stress response and flight or flight, obviously, but there's a confluence here, right? If you're in a state of agitation or anxiety or fear, you're not going to be able to access your most elevated thoughts and the sphere of the divine, and for especially in Hasidism, in kind of the more mystical approach to Judaism, where the goal, the starting point for Hasidism is the idea of devekut, of cleaving to God. And if you are in that state of mind, which is certainly natural to be there here and there, but if you don't get out of it, as Corey's saying, the length of time we spend in that, if we don't get out of that consciousness, it's just impossible to engage in devekut, to cleave to the divine. So we do have these practices that get to this, and some of them really, really well. And the first one I'll just say, well, actually, let me ask you before I delve in. Tell me what comes up for you as you think about, gosh, which Jewish practices really either speak specifically to some of the stuff Corey's talking about, or practices that just put you in that state of calm. Can you think of anything that you do as part of your Jewish observance or ritual, or things that you've seen? Remember, as I like to tell people, I used to be a teacher, so I love awkward silences. Leslie's saying something, but she's muted, and Daniel's pointing at her, and she's shaking her head. Okay, so I'll...
Button again. Saying the Shema.
Oh, awesome. Saying the Shema, right? That's right. That's right. That's right. So when and that's interesting, because it actually, yeah, as you said, we're closing our eyes. Mentally, we're focusing on God's unity, but also, as Corey just said, it's impossible to be in that stress state when you're singing. And, we don't, no one says the Shema, right? We always sing the Shema. Right. And actually, yeah, even when we just read that section of the Torah, we're chanting it, right? So, but in prayer, we sing the Shema. So that's beautiful. Anything else come up for people? Okay. Well, let me share. Daniel, is that a hand up?
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, standing for Amidah, standing for the Amidah.
Okay, great. The action that you're saying, the physical act of standing for the Amidah?
The standing, the 3 steps back, the 3 steps forward.
Right.
Appropriate places.
That's awesome. I was not thinking about that. And maybe, Corey, maybe you can speak to this before I share the main ideas I have. So one of the things that article that you sent me that, and I have to confess, I probably understood about 20% of it, but the Vagal Pathways article you sent me, he talks about changes in posture as being part of this. And so I don't know specifically what the author had in mind, but what Daniel just said. So there in the morning, there are prayers, the bulk of the prayers we say sitting down, but there's a particular prayer that we say we have to be standing up for it. And it's called the Amidah, which means the standing prayer. And so Daniel pointed to that as a practice. And I'm just wondering if that connects to any of the research.
It does directly to that changes in posture. That somehow when you, because if you're fight, flight, and freeze both involve certain level of sort of agitated passivity. You're aroused, but not moving a lot. And when you change your posture around, it kind of shocks all of that out of locking in and gives that articulate singulus a chance. So really imagine if you were changing posture while singing.
Right. The Mashiach would come.
Yeah, right. And you're done. You're done. You can go get some eat and watch TV. And the other thing they were mentioning in that article was that seeing other people's faces.
Right.
Being social and seeing smiling faces also helps.
What's fascinating? There was so much anxiety about when we shifted to the COVID world, there was so much anxiety about being apart for prayer services. And anecdotally, it seems to me that a lot of people actually are really, really enjoying it. And I saw a survey, very informal, unscientific survey done online from conservative rabbis who said that they're actually enjoying prayer more now. And I'm wondering if part of the reason is that we're all looking at each other's faces, which really is a lovely experience. So in any event, what I wanted to share, and again, I'm going to do a screen share, which will be less fabulous than Corey's, but I do want to just share it with you really quick because there's some practices that you have right in front of you. But before I do that, I want to just say that one of the best practices is the singing of a nigun, right? So that practice, which I always laugh when I sing a nigun. I'm laughing internally because I can hear my father just kind of shaking his head because my dad loved cantorial music, right? He loved these magnificent booming voices that were like awe-inspiring and which indeed are astonishing when you hear some of like the classic cantorial recording artists. But perhaps those fit into this paradigm as well. But the nigun is not just happy clappy Jews, as my dad used to call them, just sort of singing, without any purpose. And nigun, if you really put your heart to it, and very often we're in such a rush that we're not, or we're just doing it habitually and we don't see it for what it contains. A nigun, which is just a repeated melody, is something that can really bring us into this state. And for sure, it's very clear from reading the writings of the Hasidim that of the Baal Shem Tov and his teachers that followed after him, that they were very aware of the meditative power of the nigun. They weren't doing it just to sort of like, let's create a nice vibe and we'll sing together and everyone will be happy. For them, this was an extraordinarily powerful meditative tool, and it's very obvious from their writings that it was to get you to a state of consciousness that was beyond thinking. And Corey, you and I haven't really talked about that much, and maybe we'll have a chance to reflect on that later, or in the next class. But it was deliberate tool to get your mind to kind of quiet down and to get your body to relax so that you could enter into prayer. And we often don't really realize the power and the depth of the nigun. So that was one thing. And then I wanted to just go back to my handy dandy sheets here and talk about two other practices. So the first practice is a nigun. But again, as with every practice in Jewish life or any religious tradition, it's a practice that you know and you can do in your sleep. But if you do it with a low level of consciousness, it's not going to yield what it has within it. When you begin a nigun, you have to say, oh, here's an opportunity for really bringing my heart back to me and for quieting my mind and putting me into the state that we've talked about. And you have to do it with a full heart and full concentration. So there's the last psalm. There are 150 psalms, and the last verse of the last psalm is Kol Haneshama Hallelujah, Hallelujah, which probably almost everybody on this call has heard or sung. And it's interesting it's funny because the translation that happens to be here steals my punchline. So usually the way that this is translated is let every soul praise God. Kol haneshama hallelujah, hallelujah, because the word neshama means soul, and that's how it's usually translated in every prayer book. But there are many sources, and I picked one from the Midrashic tradition, which is an older source. Rabbi Levi said every single neshima, or breath, that a person breathes is praise of the Holy One, as it is written, and then he cites this verse, Kol haneshama hallelujah, because the word neshama, which means soul, is linguistically related to the word neshima, which means breath. And so following from that teaching, there is a long tradition of Jewish breath meditation. And, to be honest, in terms of what that looks like, it's not any different from any other religious traditions breathing meditation, or just basic mindfulness meditation, in which breathing is incorporated. Now, the Jewish version of it very often combines it with religious contemplation, which is beautiful, but simply sitting and breathing, and as Corey said, letting the exhale be longer than the inhale, and there are various numeric systems for saying, like, you breathe in for a count of 4, you hold it for 2, you breathe out to 6, and so you have that kind of pattern over and over. This is another practice that is deeply embedded in the Jewish tradition, and part of me wants to kind of speak in more detail about the practice, but the practice itself. But actually, I think what might be more valuable to people, given our limited time, is for me to tell you that a lot of people approach these kinds of practices within the Jewish tradition with a very wary eye and very suspicious of them, because there is a lot of collective confusion and the mistaken perception that these are practices that are external to Judaism and have sort of been bolted on by all of these, Jubus and by all of these hippie Jews who are, bringing in foreign practices to Judaism to enliven it. And while there's an element of that, I can show you very, very ancient sources that draw on meditation. They draw on breathing. I've already mentioned nigunim, that is the singing, as well as contemplation, to demonstrate that these are very deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition. There's just no doubt. And so, really, what the reason they feel foreign is because in the 20th century, at least, or I should say in the 19th and 20th century, at least outside of the traditional circles of Judaism, people left alone a lot of these practices that were perceived to be inconsistent with rationalist Judaism, which in the 19th century, took a big kind of hold on European society, and that influenced the Jewish world. So really, this is about reclaiming these practices that are part of our ancient tradition. I would even say, and this is a little provocative, and for sure many people would not accept this, many rabbis would not accept this, but I would say that to envision a full prayer life that's running on 6 cylinders, to use a not very useful metaphor in terms of prayer, to do that without methods of contemplation or meditation or tools to kind of get around your anxious mind and to get into your body a little more, I would say that makes the full approach to prayer impossible, at least in my experience. And so whether one draws on them a little bit or whether they're central to one's practice, I think that using nigunim as a way to calm your body, to calm your mind and to feel your body and to put your physiology into a state of openness, and using breathing techniques, which is extended periods where you're simply breathing out calmly and breathing in. These are just essential to the life of prayer. And I think the last thing that I want to share with you is mantra meditation. So this teaching from Likutei Moharan is the kind of magnum opus of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And he talks about the practice of hitbodedut. Now, hitbodedut in and of itself just means solitude. But he would use that solitude in a couple of different ways. One is he would use it just to talk to God, which is like spontaneous outpouring of the heart. But the part that I want to focus on is that Rabbi Nachman and others would really emphasize the repetition of a mantra. So he said that when you go out for hitbodedut, the idea is to empty yourself of all thought. And then he says here in a later part of that same book, even if a person can only say one thing, that is one phrase, he should be resolute and say that thing over and over again endlessly. So keep in mind, when Rabbi Nachman, he's not just writing this, right? You can imagine him in the forest walking around, and he's saying a phrase again and again and again. He did it literally for hours every day, and he sort of recommended to his Hasidim, to his followers, that they should do at least an hour a day, which probably means that he's doing hours a day of chanting and meditation and prayer. And so one can use any phrase, and I'll wrap up with this, and then we'll turn it over to questions. One can use any phrase in mantra meditation. You can use an English phrase. You can use, God is one, God loves me. For those who want to connect a little bit more to the Hebrew, to the tradition of the Hebrew language, Rabbi Nachman would use the phrase Ribono shel Olam, which means master of the world. And that was kind of his famous phrase that he recommended to people to recite just endlessly over and over, Ribono Shel Olam. Whoops, I wrote Riboni. Ribono Shel Olam. What it means is master, Ribon, Shel of Olam, the world, master of the world. And just that phrase said over and over again. So what you would do is you would put yourself in a quiet spot, and where you're not going to be interrupted. You're not worried about being interrupted. You've got your phone off, and even if it's only a few minutes you have, you would close your eyes, and if it feels good to you to put on a tallis, then you should put on a tallis, but you certainly do not need to. And just repeat that phrase and find the right tone and the right speed that makes you feel relaxed. And you say Ribono Shel Olam over and over and over and over again. Not even think, you don't have to worry about the meaning. I would encourage you, in fact, not to think about theology. What does it mean for there to be a master of the world? What does that, is God up on a mountain with a beard? You're just saying the sounds, Ribono Shel Olam. So again, to wrap up, we have a rich array of practices in our tradition geared towards calming us and bringing us into a state where we can use our souls to move through the world and not just our anxious minds. And I've mentioned breathing meditation, chanting, and nigunim, all of which are immediately accessible to you, and that it's good for us to draw on. So I'm going to pause there, and let's just see if there are, either if Corey has a kind of closing line he wants to offer, or if people have questions that they want to ask about about anything I've said or anything that Corey has said.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful. Finding those examples. And I would encourage finding ways inside your Jewish life to access these states that I'm talking about, the parasympathetic nervous system dominance that allows you to think. And even trying the wet noodle and the sigh and all of that as well, and see what you can do, but realize better the function, the neurological function of your faith. I'd love to hear what any questions you might have.
Anyone? Okay, I'm just going to check.
Or statements. They don't have to be questions. Yeah.
Right. I'm just checking the chat screen. Okay.
Can I have a quick question?
Go for it.
You mentioned that the wet noodle and some of the other things only last for a minute or two. So is it something that people should do several times during the day, or how do you get more lasting relief?
I'm glad you asked. It's just, it's not the methodology that makes them short-lived. It's just the nature of reality. So you get calm for a while, but something's going to trigger you to get sympathetic nervous system dominant again, is what I was pointing out. So if you're someone like me who's very good at perceiving things as threats, I can get myself calmed down with the wet noodle and present, but something will come along and I'll perceive it as a threat again. That said, this seems like the more and I do this dozens of times a day, and the more I do it, the less I'm perceiving things as threats in general. So it kind of makes you better at it. It's an increase up into the right arrow, but I think it's something we need to be prepared to always do, just given the nature of our being, or just go on permanent vacation.
Right. So my response to that would just be, connecting it back to the teaching of Simcha Bunim, who talked about our capacity to carry such big burdens. I think so much of it is just awareness of what is going on for you. Certainly, sometimes when we're stressed, we are aware of it, right? Sometimes it's just so powerful that we know we have to deal with it. But I think it's also the case that very often we're not aware when we might need to do the wet noodle, or when the wet noodle would benefit us. And so making time just to reflect on what's going on internally and to see whether you actually are enduring stress and managing it will help you know when it's time to employ another practice.
That's a really good point.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I want to thank Corey, and I want to tell you that the second and third sessions of this class are going to be at 3 p.m. on the next 2 Thursdays. Is that accurate? At 3 p.m. So not at the same time as today's class. They'll be at 3 p.m. And Corey, you want to just give people a 30-second take on what we'll cover in the next class?
Next class, yes, thank you. Next time, now that we're going to have the wet noodling between now and then and have that as a skill, we'll be able to move on to see how we can manage that strain threshold that I talked about, how you can keep your strain threshold as wide as possible. And that's done through maintaining your own sources of vitality, of sort of subjective energy. And there's some interesting psychology around that I want to, just like today, present sort of the best practices psychology around managing one's own vitality and remaining vital and engaged, which is where you'll be when you get back into your cortex. And then to see how the rabbi and I can share back and forth between faith and science on that interesting topic. And then the class after that, we'll talk about how to take all of these things, wet noodling, et cetera, and knowing your sources of vitality and build them into a life plan. Build them into your schedule, very literally. I want you to leave with a schedule.
Awesome. I also want to say that unless Corey disagrees, and I don't think he would, if you know folks who you think would benefit from this, it would be okay for them to jump into the second session, even if they were not part of the first session.
Sure, they can watch this one, right?
That's true. They can also watch this one. Yeah. So, because we're recording it. So please let folks know about it if you know people who you think this would benefit. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time and attention. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Corey, for your super interesting presentation and ideas and research.
Rabbi.
I'll talk to you soon, Corey, and then we'll see you all next time at 3 p.m.
All right. Thank you, Jenny, for your moderating.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.